Hey, herd watchers. We have not spoken in a little while, so we're back in the car. We're going to do this thing. I have a minute or a few minutes here. Hopefully my iPhone does not overheat. It tends to do that when it's under the sun. But, wow. You know, I was really hoping to come back from taking a little bit of a break and talk about Google and the insanity that's going on there, and we have a lot about political correctness to talk about in a larger context. But obviously there's no way to not talk about what happened in Charlottesville right now. And so let's go ahead and do that and maybe put that in some context. Now, even though it's futile and even though I hate doing it, I'm going to take a minute right up front and answer the obvious question, which is that nothing I'm about to say here is in support of the ideology behind National Socialism or the white supremacists or any of the rest of it. God, my online history stretches back since I was 13 years old, and I defy you in all of that to find even a moment where I supported any concept other than the objectivist concept of the treatment of individuals as individuals, and that the race and ethnicity that you are part of, and even to an extent your core underlying religious belief, has nothing to do with your capability and has nothing to do thus with how I see you and how I should treat you. Now, we could get into, and I have been, people have attempted to make the argument with me that I have, because I'm a white male, I have some inherent racial bias and whatever. And I have no intention of arguing that with you at the moment. That's basically, it's a fool's game. If you're going to insist that I hold some sort of crypto-racist belief system because of the place I was born or the color of my skin or whatever, that's a almost religious belief that you hold, and nothing I do or say is ever going to get me out of that classification for you. So I have no more intention of arguing with it with you than I have arguing with you that I'm not an alien lizard in a human suit. Whatever, you're going to believe what you're going to believe. But that said, the other thing you need to look at is that I have a consistent history of First Amendment essentialism. I consider the right to free speech essentially unbounded, and that the combination of the First and Second Amendment, the right to speak your mind freely even if your opinion is unpopular or abhorrent, and the right to be free from violent coercion of others, that the intersection of those two rights is where democracy lives. And without either of those, democracy slowly fades, rots, and dies on the vine. And what you see happen in Charlottesville is exactly the intersection of those two principles. So for those of you that might not know what happened, though I can't imagine who those might be, we had a couple of things going on in Charlottesville as a nation that sort of combined to cause a nightmarish pile of stupidity that resulted ultimately in some deaths, tragically. And the confluence was kind of this. So there was a Unite the Right rally that came about as a reaction to political correctness, as a reaction to this sort of movement that's been going on, this sort of hyper PC movement that has been opposing Donald Trump as one of its aspects. And when they couldn't stop Donald Trump, they've been turning that inward to take what victories they can get. And one of the side effects of that has been them sort of rampaging through the South and removing all the Civil War memorials that they can find that refer to the Confederacy. And they're trying to do this on the grounds that having a statue to Confederate soldiers or Confederate fighters is inherently racist. Now, certainly there was a lot about what the South stood for that I disagree with, but it's important contextually to understand that as part of the healing process after the Civil War, is one of the reasons that the nation could move forward. We agreed sort of collectively at the time to accept the Southern fighters as patriots who maybe were misguided, but that they were fighting for the survival of the nation as they saw it, and that we conferred a number of military honors on Confederate soldiers, that we agreed that Confederate soldiers were eligible for national honors, and as such, we have a moral obligation to recognize that those that fought on the side of the Confederacy, that those soldiers, we have accepted those as men who were fighting for America. We do not define those as terrorists. We do not define those the way we define war criminals and Nazis and so on. So in that sense, it is wrong to sort of now retroactively decide that we're going to remove those statues that are honoring those. I'll be right back. I'm going to give my iPhone a chance to cool down, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to go and get my lunch. Hang on a minute. All right, we're back. So group one, the sort of, right-wing, anti-political correctness crowd that had sort of taken up this cause of preserving one of the monuments that was under threat in Charlottesville. We got those guys. And we now have, along with them, because of this intersection between sort of right-wing ideology and the Confederacy angle, unfortunately, there were also a number of these, KKK sort of white supremacist, far right white nationalist groups that decided to sort of also jump on the bandwagon and roll down there for this particular event. Now, some of these guys have a history of marching in that area as well. One of the reasons why I think this was a horrible time and place for the Unite the Right people to pick, but certainly nobody ever asked my opinion. I wasn't part of any of this, and I didn't go to the rally. So, the stage is set on the right. We have the vast majority of the people that showed up for this rally were generic, peaceful, sort of conservative types, Donald Trump supporters, and then mixed in with those, you have a number of these idiots running around in their sheets, running around with their torches, running around basically being loud and doing that sort of stuff. On the left-hand side, there was a counter-protest. Now, there is a group of people on the left who intended to go and be nonviolent and basically just sort of counter-march and chant and do whatever it is that they were going to do, sort of to show their point. And then along with them was the much more organized, very heavily funded groups that go all around the anti-fascist or Antifa groups and the Black Lives Matter component that were also going there. Now, ostensibly on paper, we have, one could draw some sort of equivalences here. If we were trading baseball cards or building fantasy football teams, it looks like we have a balance, that there's the regular rational people with differing political opinions who have no intention of causing violence and are not filled with anger and hate, and then we have the fringes on the left and the right who have no problem with violence and causing trouble and, generally speaking, being abhorrent. So on paper, you would think that that's the case, except it's not. The sort of white nationalist right enjoys none of the financial, political, and media support that the anti-fascist left and the Black Lives Matter movement enjoy. In other words, other than as an object of scorn and ridicule, you're never going to see a representative of the, really tiny Ku Klux Klan be taken onto CNN. Now, part of that's because the last thing in the world CNN wants to do is give these guys a chance to speak, because it's clear how much the Klan's ideology agrees with much of what comes out of the Democratic Party that they were born from, but also because CNN has no intention of justifying that ideology, and rightly so. On the other hand, on the left, Black Lives Matter and the anti-fascist groups are incredibly well funded. They're funded directly by the Democratic National Committee. They enjoy money from George Soros. They have budgets of millions of dollars. They are supported by large campus groups. They're supported by Google. They're supported by Microsoft. They're supported by openly supported by multi-million-dollar corporations, and they're often taken onto CNN and given, hours and hours and hours of sympathetic airtime. They were given support by Barack Obama when he was president. So, in short, whereas on the right-hand side you were looking at, less than 1% of the attendees were on sort of the fringe, far more than that on the left, that probably 60 or 70% of those who attended were anti-fascist Black Lives Matter groups members, and these are groups that have a documented history of initiating violence in political contexts. Black Lives Matter has a history of rioting and initiating violence against both civilians and police officers, and in fact, violence against police officers did occur in Charlottesville. And you have Antifa, who have a history of rioting, arson, destruction of personal property, and personal assault on unarmed political speech opponents. So these groups are not equivalent, and this is important. While you might, like me, share an abhorrence for the white nationalist ideology, there have been no recent cases, and by recent I mean in the last decade or more. You have to go way, way back for the last time you find that the KKK initiated violence in a large scale. The right, the members of the right that gathered in Charlottesville have no history of violence, and in fact, a number of these men, the people who came to this rally, and given the crossover with the Second Amendment crowd, were fairly heavily armed, and even under threat of violence, even when the violence kicked off, there's no indication that these guys unlimbered their AR-15s and started doing a militia thing out into the crowd. So I caution you against drawing a connection between ideology and violence. While you may, on the surface, agree with the idea espoused by the anti-fascist group, while you may agree with the point Black Lives Matter tries to make about systemic racism, to the extent that they have a point, these are groups that initiate political violence in an organized, well-funded, and deliberate way. They consider political violence a core tool of their movement. And on the other side, you have a group who's the fringe group, the white nationalists, whose ideology is abhorrent, but who have no history of institutional violence. They have no history of using, meaning recent history, certainly when they were the militant arm of the KKK, of the Democratic Party. The KKK did in fact have a history of violence, and nobody's taking that away, but I mean the modern sort of KKK and the post-Robert Byrd thing, after the DNC decided to try and tone it down and see if they could pawn the KKK off on the Republican Party, sort of rebranded as our problem. So the groups on the right, the fringe was a very small percentage of the group and has no history of violence. On the left, the fringe was the getting close to the majority of the people in attendance, and they have a documented history of violence in very recent times. And what happened? Well, in this environment where you have a heavily charged political atmosphere, you would think that the answer would be to have a heavy police presence, an even-handed and heavy police presence that had the goal of allowing political speech to occur while preventing violence. That's supposed to be the purpose of law enforcement. But because Charlottesville is run by a far left-leaning government, we had what we have seen before in circumstances like this. The police were given an order to stand down so that they did not interfere with... Oh, I think my iPhone's heating up. We will talk in a minute. Okay, so what I was saying is what we saw happen was what we've seen happen before when these sort of demonstrations occur in left-leaning areas, which is the police were given a stand-down order. In other words, they were told not to attempt to sort of get involved or quell tensions. And in that context, the police allowed the Antifa group to mobilize with their faces covered, with weaponry, and initiate contact, and the police sort of stayed out of it. Meanwhile, the Charlottesville government was sort of heaping all sorts of condemnation on the event, basically making it clear that they were going to be very happy if there was a way to prevent this event from happening. And along with the signal of the police deliberately allowing the Antifa groups to mobilize with their weaponry, the stage was set where those groups that intended to shut their political opponents down with the initiation of violence had every reason to believe that they were being encouraged and allowed to do so by the government of Charlottesville. And they were being encouraged and allowed to do so. So violence broke out, as it does so many other times when Antifa shows up. This was not, despite what CNN and MSNBC are going to attempt to spin it as. If you look at the video and the social media from the time, the contemporaneous information that comes out, what you're going to see is that, as happened at all the Donald Trump rallies, as happened at any number of events, college campus speakers, young Republicans events, that the Antifa groups and the Black Lives Matter groups gathered, began personally assaulting those who held views they didn't like. They used a variety of weapons. In this case, there were bottles filled with concrete, sticks. They throw mace, both commercial and homemade chemical agents. There were no indications of arson. Several police officers were attacked. In other words, it was the left that initiated the large-scale violent contact because it was their intention, their well-funded, well-publicized intention to use political violence to shut this rally down in the way they have done across this nation for years now. This is, there's really no way around that. Now, does any of that excuse the violent response from some on the white nationalist side? No, but nothing excuses the ideology of the white nationalists to begin with. I mean, I'm not shocked that they would respond in that manner. I don't think they're wrapped real tight to begin with. But they didn't initiate the violence to the best of anyone's information. And more importantly, the initiation of violence is not their primary tool, and they don't have a history of doing so, a recent history of doing so. So the counter-march started Friday night. There was, a lot of political violence, low-scale violence that occurred, and it sort of broke out into this wide-scale running battle across Charlottesville. And then the police decided to step in. The government started to step in. If you were a cynic, you would say right after they got everything they wanted, right when the propaganda value was at its height, and the narrative of sort of, oh my God, look what happens when the alt-right gets together was perfectly spun up. This event was going exactly the way CNN and MSNBC and the Charlottesville government sort of expected and had scripted it to go. And then this crazy asshole who appears to be a registered Republican and have far-right sympathies, in the midst of a pile of stupidity, this asshole, crazy, decides that he's going to drive his car into a bunch of anti-fascist supporters. And there's just no way around the fact that this looks like a deliberate case of domestic violence, that he did this for an ideological reason. He did it against his ideological opponents, and that this was a political attack. There's no way around it. Do I think that tragedy is a condemnation of Donald Trump and the Donald Trump supporters, the way CNN and the mainstream media is attempting to say it? No. Then again, No, I don't. I don't think he's one of that group. I think he's, a sort of twisted fringer in the same way that that guy that took his rifle and shot at a lot of GOPers, I don't think he represents the mainstream of the Democratic Party. I do think he's a lot closer to representing the mainstream of the anti-fascist community. And certainly Black Lives Matter has a history of assassinating political opponents and police officers. So I think there might be a slightly better case to be made that the equivalent political violence on the left is a little closer to the left's mainstream right now than it is on the right. But even at that, I certainly don't consider him representative of the Democratic Party, and I did not attempt to tie him directly to Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders. Even during the time of the campaign when Bernie Sanders supporters were sort of the nascent anti-fascist community, which was the Bernie Sanders supporters that would descend upon Donald Trump rallies and inflict political violence, I didn't think they were doing that at Bernie Sanders' instigation. We do know that they were doing it at the instigation of the Democratic Party and that the DNC was funneling money to them. But even then, I don't consider them representative of the rank and file of the left. So all I'm going to say about this guy and the attempt to draw his connection to Donald Trump is that the right has much less history in recent years of any of this. Violence on the right is not funded by the GOP. It doesn't have tens of millions of dollars to throw around the way it does on the left. There's no history of that action on the right. I think there's a good case to be made that this guy is an aberration. And I speak to people who go, and as you see this ramp up of violence that's come since Donald Trump culminated in this guy driving into the thing, and obviously that shows you that white supremacist violence is on the rise. But that theory simply does not intellectually stand up to scrutiny. I understand what it feels like to those people who are in groups that feel themselves under threat, and you have nothing but my support and my sympathy. Those of you who know me, hopefully you know that, with luck, your feelings have not caused you to lose faith in me individually. But when you look at the rise of violence, it's very easy to confirmation bias and go that that's been with the rise of Donald Trump. But really the violence that you've seen has been initiated by the left in their sort of deranged anti-Donald Trump freak out. So has political violence been on the rise since Donald Trump? Yeah, it absolutely has. Has any of that political violence on a large scale been instigated by Donald Trump supporters? The answer is no. Has the money that's being funneled into political violence come from the right into Donald Trump supporters? The answer is no. So the rise of political violence in the era of Trump is not racists rampaging through the country, rioting and shutting down colleges and assassinating people and attempting to kill elected officials and murdering police officers. That's the left. That's all on the left. So there has been a rise in political violence, but it's not a rising tide of white nationalist racism. It's just not. That's just not where the violence is coming from. I understand that this rising violence is scary for everyone. It is certainly not anything any of us want. But there's nothing to be gained in figuring out how to stop it by going along with the narrative that Donald Trump and the right is to blame, while ignoring the tens of millions of dollars being poured by the DNC, by Soros-backed funding groups, by the left, by Hollywood, and the tacit support of government and many states that's being funneled to groups that actually provably have a history of political violence. By focusing on this sort of anti-right-wing rhetoric and ignoring the real organizations with a funded, stated goal of political violence, you are not going to solve the political violence problem. And all you're doing is isolating the right more. And I'll say what I've said before. We are most of the military. We own most of the guns. We have almost all of the ammunition. We have all the violent training on our side. If we were the problem with political violence, sticks and tones at a rally is not the way you would have it. If we were the problem, you would have a much larger problem. So take all that for what it's worth. Under no circumstances am I forgiving or mitigating violence. I want you to roll this back to the part of the clip where I in no way attempted to distance this idiot from his right-wing ideology. And, so when I inevitably get comments that I'm being an apologist, when I inevitably get comments that I'm some sort of crypto racist, when I inevitably get, but Trump said throw them out comments, you're welcome to make them. And if you make a well-reasoned argument, I will respond to them. If you are a personal acquaintance or a friend of mine, hit me up in any one of the ways we have to talk, and I'm more than happy to discuss this with you at length. But in the meantime, look past the narrative, and we're not going to get anywhere, particularly if those on the left do not take a good hard look at where the violence is coming from. And I've been talking about this for 5 years now. This is where we are as a nation, and it's not going to get any better. It's not going to get any better until we understand where the violence is coming from. There's rhetoric to be tamped down on all sides, but that's talk. You want to find out where the violence is coming from, you find out who has violence as a core tool. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Herd Watching. I'm sorry for the large break. I'm deeply saddened by the topic we had to address when I came back. It certainly wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I don't think it's what any of us wanted to be talking about. We'll talk later on this week about the media narrative and the reaction to the event, and sort of how they've been dealing with Donald Trump's statements about it, and how I will compare sort of the way Donald Trump reacted to this to the way Barack Obama reacted to some of the Black Lives Matter violence. There's a lot more to talk about. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, but this video is already long, and I don't want to attempt to use this event too much as a launching board into my normal topics, other than what I've already done, connecting it to this sort of political violence movement, because I think there's no way to separate that out. We'll talk about the media later. We'll talk about Airbnb. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about Google. A lot going on. All right. I hope you found this informative. Reach out to me in social media or in the comments below. Like and follow Herd Watching on Facebook. Like and follow Riding Herd on Facebook and Twitter. Herd Watching on Twitter, and by all means, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take it easy.